Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast. The P.A.S. Report provides an honest analysis on the critical issues that matter to you without the biased media filters. Here's your host, Professor Nicholas Giordano.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano. And now that the powerful elite are done with their little party in Davos, it shows you just how sick some of these people really are. And if you listen to the speeches by people like John Kerry and Al Gore, people who have made millions upon millions, in Al Gore's case, hundreds of millions of dollars off their little schemes, you see how they truly believe that the powerful elite, not you, only the powerful elite can solve all problems. It is clear that they have no faith in ordinary people to do the right thing. We must surrender our liberties to governments and intergovernmental organizations because they don't trust us and they don't like us. The message is clear. You are to blame for everything, especially climate change. You will own nothing, and you will be happy. You'll have your freedom of movement restricted, and when you want to go outside the zone you live in, you need to seek approval from the government. But don't worry, the powerful elite, they'll still be able to travel in their convoys and on their private jets. They'll still be able to attend these parties. These people believe that they are the moral holy warriors of the 21st century. They are so self-absorbed that they're blind to the hypocrisy of their virtue signaling. They are phonies. And when you really listen to them, you see how shallow and unintelligent they really are. And now that Davos has ended, I'm bringing in a great guest. I got Professor Michael Rectenwald returning to the P.A.S. Report. He just wrote a new book breaking down the darkness of these power-hungry fools. And you should check it out. The Great Reset and the Struggle for Liberty, Unraveling the Global Agenda. We are going to talk about his new book. We're going to talk about the Great Reset. We're going to talk about how ordinary people can push back against this scheme. Before I bring the professor on, subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. And if you find the show informative, share it with your family and friends. Also, don't forget to visit the PAS Report website, pasreport.com. Sign up for the newsletter there. And with that out of the way, I want to welcome back to the PAS Report Professor Michael Rectenwald. Michael, glad you could join me. How are you today?
Great, Nick. How are you?
Can you explain to the audience about the Great Reset and what the goal is of these people in power?
Yeah, well, I mean, the Great Reset ushers in what's called stakeholder capitalism. The objective of the Great Reset really is to accelerate the implementation of the UN's Agenda 2030 and its sustainable development goals. So stakeholder capitalism is the system that they want to replace the world economic system with, and that is undertaken through these public-private partnerships. So what it is the World Economic Forum has coordinated a vast assemblage of corporate partners and is ushering in like a system whereby economics are no longer geared toward profit, but rather supposedly to benefit all stakeholders. And these stakeholders are supposedly anybody who either benefits from or may suffer harm from corporate behavior. But really what it comes down to is a kind of shared monopoly scheme whereby they drive the non-compliant out of business and out of the economy, leaving only the compliant. So I call it the woke cartel that's left in place. So it's a monopoly scheme or a shared monopoly scheme. The stakeholders really are only the preferred producers and the oligarchical power people that are left in place. We don't really have any stake in this system. They don't give ordinary people any kind of say in what is being implemented. And likewise, it's a totalitarian regime, really, that's being ushered in.
And they use the word capitalism in order to get buy-in, but it's not really capitalism. What you're seeing is the blurring of the lines of government entities and intergovernmental organizations and the private corporations that exist. Now, one of the things that I think is extremely concerning is we have examples of how life is actually worse off when it comes to the Great Reset Agenda 2030. Unfortunately, people, they don't really understand what's going on. Why are the politicians supporting this idea? The politicians in power, when these countries, nation states, have to surrender their sovereignty essentially under this system.
They're buying in because they have become credulous of the whole agenda, which they believe, where they may play along with the agenda, that there's this imminent climate catastrophe. I call it climate catastrophism in the book. They are buying into the idea that all of these sectors of the economy, and inclusive of our behavior, this is really how it affects individuals, must be reset. Of course, we see the effects of this already. The attack on the fossil fuel industries, of course, the subsequent hike in pricing and the inflation, and of course, we're going to see some of the effects that are being felt, like in the Netherlands and what Sri Lanka has recently gone through. If they touch the agricultural sector, which is certainly on the agenda, this would lead to reduced output by a great deal, definite hunger, world hunger, famines possibly, and so forth. So all of this is what they don't really understand. And so it's kind of, I've compared it to Mao's Great Leap Forward, which I call in the book the Great Leap Backward. It's comparable to that. It's absurd, this crazy implementation and foisting on the economic system this rather unscientific ideological program.
In the book, you lay out how basically the Klaus Schwabs of the world, the Bill Gates of the world, they view the people as the problem. I mean, let's be honest. They don't trust us. They don't trust ordinary people to make good decisions in life. And so they feel that they need to control and force us to make the good decisions. Isn't that correct?
Yeah. I mean, they think that not only don't they trust us, they actually look at us as a scourge on the planet, whose consumption must be reduced, whose actual numbers must be reduced. So it's a very neo-Malthusian project. That is, they mean to intervene in the population reproduction, and they call it reproductive rights, ironically. But when they talk about reproductive rights, they really don't mean the right to reproduce. They mean the right to foist on us the control of our population, our reproduction. So they don't look at us as anyone. They think that we basically have to be controlled because for our own good, we need this kind of oligarchical elite oversight and control. Indeed.
What amazes me is always how they're so hypocritical, because when we talk about the idea of nature and nature taking its course, basically they want to get into the game of population control. And you brought up, communist China and the Great Leap Forward. How well did the one-child policy work out for China when they tried to embark on this idea of population control?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a disaster. They're now lacking workforce, and of course, they're unable to reproduce their own society. That is kind of what will happen here. Besides the kind of horrors that occurred in communist China under Mao with the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, but the Great Leap Forward intervened in the industrial and agricultural sectors and led to the largest famine in world history. 20 to 43 million people died either by famine or murder by the state. So yeah, it's unbelievable that every time they have an idea of a project, they call it great. And they unironically use this phrase when every kind of great project that the elites have attempted in the past have ended in total catastrophe.
Yeah, it's the so-called experts, right? I mean, we see this all over the place, that the so-called experts, where they push these policy agendas. And you could look here in the United States as far as our foreign policy over the course of the last 30 to 40 years. You could look at the whole response to the coronavirus. They always say, listen to the experts, and yet the experts usually are proven wrong a lot of the times.
Yeah.
But more importantly, we have this cabal of people that say, don't worry, there won't be a famine. You'll be able to eat fake meat, right? Now, I see more and more articles about mealworm being used to create meat. They hate meat so much, yet they try and want to replicate the taste of it. What is it, this idea? You have people like Bill Gates buying farmlands. Does that concern you? And when we're selling farmland, shouldn't we be concerned about what's the intent of what they're going to do with that farmland? If they intend to buy that farmland in order to change it, make sure it's not farmland anymore. How big of a deal is that?
I mean, this is huge. What they're talking about is, in fact, the World Economic Forum's annual meeting started already. Is called Cooperation in a Fragmented World. So what they hate is fragmentation, and what that means is they love consolidation. They want to consolidate the farmland in the hands of a few preferred producers. Now, those who are able to afford to farm under the 2030 Agenda Sustainable Development Goals. And that means that the small farmer is driven out of business and large farms are bought up, and small farms are bought up by the preferred producers or the state, as in the case of New Zealand. I'm sorry, and the Netherlands. So we're looking at this mass consolidation on the top because they don't trust the small producer to meet the sustainable development goals, and they've made it unaffordable for them to do so. And what Gates has on the agenda in buying all this farmland is producing, meeting the 2030 agenda goals, but also, outmoding meat, perhaps even vaccinating cattle. This is all part and parcel of what's going on. They want to vaccinate all the livestock. And this way, we would have no way to avoid some medical interventions. I don't know if you're on YouTube or not, so I'll be careful, that we might not otherwise accept into our bodies.
It's concerning, to say the least. And I want to take up the idea of democracy when we get back. We're going to take a quick break, but I want to talk about this threat to democracy that they're constantly trotting out there, but they don't really believe in democracy. So stick around. We'll be right back. As someone who worked in emergency management, I routinely sounded the alarm bells on our outdated grid system. Think back to 2003 when a tree branch hit a power line in Ohio, shutting down power to the entire eastern seaboard. Around 100 people died, and this was one of the costliest disasters in American history, with losses totaling over $60 billion. Even the White House sees it. They're saying 2/3 of the grid are at least 25 years old, and they recently announced billions of dollars to update it. But we're talking about the government here. How long do you think that's going to take, if at all? When an incident happens, you have to rely on yourself. Be prepared for yourself and your family. With the Patriot Power Generator, you get a solar generator that doesn't install into your house because it's portable. You can take it with you, even use it inside. But it's powerful enough for your phones, medical devices, and even your fridge. Right now, you can go to 4patriots.com, use code P.A.S. to get 10% off your first purchase on anything in the store, including the Patriot Power Generator. You'll also get their famous guarantee for an entire year after your order, plus free shipping on orders over $97. A portion of every sale is donated to charities who support veterans and their families. Just go to 4patriots.com, use code P.A.S. to get 10% off. That's 4patriots.com, use code P.A.S. to get yours today. What really gets me aggravated is when you have the people that are pushing for this idea of the Great Reset. They say they're pushing it in the name of democracy, right? That anyone that questions what they're doing is a threat to democracy. Apparently, in a free society, you're no longer allowed to welcome questions, and you can't post things on YouTube that go against their accepted narratives. So when we look at this, you say the struggle for liberty is essential here, because if this goes through, the way we grew up, the America that we knew, is gone. And how quickly do you think this can happen? I know they have the target date of 2030. Do you think it's possible that the people of the United States, as well as the politicians who are supposed to represent us, will surrender their sovereignty to these intergovernmental organizations?
Well, they're doing it surreptitiously. The World Economic Forum and their corporate partners, they are, signing all these corporations into the ESG indexing, the ESG score. And this is the way they're circumventing legislation. So they're able to change the economic structure without changing any laws. Of course, there is going to be some significant pushback, I think, and there has begun to be some pushback at the governmental level. We saw 19 states, attorneys generals of 19 states are suggesting, and in fact, many have pulled their money from the massive asset managers that are driving this on the economic level. That is, they're pulling their money from BlackRock Inc. and State Street and UBS and the Vanguard Group, because all of these groups, they control the lion's share of the world's assets. Between the top three asset managers, they control $22 trillion worth of assets. And BlackRock controls $10 trillion on their own. And of course, Larry Fink is one of the major exponents of this, if not the major exponent in the financial sector, which is who is driving all of this capital toward these ESG abiding companies and away from others. And that's why I call it a cartel scheme and a shared monopoly scheme. This woke cartel will have the lion's share of all resources and capital investments, keeping the others out of the game and starving them of capital.
Yeah, and
that's the objective.
According to a New York State report, so New York State moved in this ESG direction where the pension funds divested from fossil fuel industries and everything. And according to New York State's own report, their own study stated that it's not in the best interest of the pension holders to do this, that the pension holders are going to be the ones to suffer. And yet it still went ahead, full steam ahead. It still went into effect. So it is concerning. I miss the Democrats of the 1990s that actually rejected the Kyoto Protocol, the International Criminal Court, because they didn't want to surrender America's sovereignty to these powerful groups that exist out there. But you, in your book, you lay out a 9-point plan of what can be done in order to push back against this Great Reset. Can you explain some of those points, particularly those things that ordinary people that are listening to this program can actually do in order to push back against the agenda?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, the 9-point plan, which is part of what I'm calling the Grand Refusal, is directed strictly at ordinary people and what they can do. And first of all, one of the major hubs of this is the CBDC, the central bank digital currency. So the ordinary person can refuse the CBDC by continuing to practice the use of cash and other means of exchange so that you're not tied up in the CBD system, because the CBDC will give the Fed, in the case of the United States, total surveillance over spending, saving, and debt. And likewise, all transactions will be transparent to the central bank and likewise the federal government. We must refuse the CBDC. This is essential. And that means we have to keep other avenues of transaction open. That's just one. That's the first point. And the second point is we need to refuse what they're doing with digital identity. Digital identity is not a means of identification. It is a total database on you, a digital database that basically records and keeps track of every move you make from the cradle to the grave and possibly beyond the grave, actually. And this could be tied, of course, to a personal carbon footprint allowance, but also a social credit score. Likewise, they could use this as a profile to shut you out of the economy because the digital identity will be connected to CBDCs.
Well, I think it's important that you just brought that up because we are seeing, I believe it's Oxford or maybe another place in England, but we know that there's a place in England, I can't recall, Katie Hopkins was talking about it, where you have to have passes in order to travel. You could travel in certain districts during certain times, and during other times, you need passes to travel in your own neighborhoods, in your own cities and towns. And so I think it's important that you talk about that. But more importantly, is the idea that you just brought up of this social credit system, because it was our tech companies that served as the impetus of China's social credit system. And it's now being imported here in the United States, is it not?
Yeah, absolutely. It's Alibaba, the Alibaba Group in China, that is basically the private partner of the public-private partnership regime in China that is running the social credit score system over there. And Google is developing a social credit score system here. So this is all on the table. When I say refuse the digital identity, it's not so easy as just saying no. You have to find out how it's being implemented, and it's going to come through corporations first. And then they'll attach themselves to the state. And the corporations will be big digital, as I pointed out in Google Archipelago, is the leading edge of this new totalitarian leftist regime. So we need to keep our eyes on how they're going to subtly introduce digital identity through corporations, likely banks. Okay. And so we need to, speaking of that, we need to pull our money out of ESG abiding and lending banks. This means most of the majors, frankly. Bank of America being the leading edge here, because Bank of America is solidly behind stakeholder capitalism and the ESG score. Brian Moynihan, the CEO of Bank of America, at the last annual meeting in May 2022, suggested that companies and people who do not abide by the ESG are not worthy of loans, and they should wither on the vine. He effectively said straight up, if they're below the stakeholder bar, they don't deserve money. That means withholding loans from them. So we need to keep out of these banks, pull out of these banks, because they are feeding the beast. We would be feeding the beast if we keep our money in these banks.
And just to go on one of your points right there, if you take Bank of America or even Citigroup, one of the things people don't realize, and the media, God forbid, should actually cover it and expose it, is the fact that they've been pushing a political agenda for a while now. I mean, I think it was 2015 or 2016 where these banks announced that they're not going to be providing loans for firearm stores, that any firearm stores they're not going to provide credit cards to. And so we really see that it doesn't matter what state legislative bodies do, because we elect the state legislature to represent us and to pass our laws. It doesn't matter if a state legislature says you have to be 18 and older to purchase a firearm. These banks say what matters is that we're the ones that will determine what age you have to be to purchase a firearm until we actually ban firearms, because they won't be able to get loans to manufacture them, just like the fossil fuel industry won't be able to get loans to expand production or even exploration to finding new oil and gas. So it's been going on a while. Why are people finally starting to wake up?
Well, I think it's becoming clear with the pinch, the very severe effects of this, from the gas prices to the oil prices and the price of food. All of this is coming clear that this is going to be a major squeeze. And, the UN has been arguing for decades that the consumption of the first world or the developed world or what have you has to be vastly reduced. And so this is the means by which they're reducing it, using inflation, using a tax on the fossil fuel industry. I mean, the Biden administration signed into law at least 12 or passed or pushed or whatever you want to call it. It's not really passing it, just by fiat, 12 executive orders attacking the fossil fuel industry. And of course, the so-called Inflation Reduction Act earmarks $287 billion to mitigating climate change. That means attacking the fossil fuel industry. And so this is when I say the fossil fuel industry, this is everything, really. These almost all products that we consume are fossil fuel based to one extent or another. So it's going to drive the cost of everything up, and people will wake up to the reality of what's happening when everything becomes more expensive, and in fact, many things are just not allowed to be purchased, like guns. I mean, this is the kind of political profiling that's going to go on, and people will feel the squeeze. And when they do, they'll start to wake up to what this is about.
Now, they were actually slowly putting this into place. It was incremental. That it was the way they want to do it. Yeah. If I could talk, the silver lining of COVID, essentially, is I think it made them a little too ambitious to really speed through their plans, speed up timelines and agendas, and really expose the totalitarian nature of them and their authority. What scares me, though, is that people were overly compliant when it came to all the COVID rules and restrictions and mandates. Do you think that the people of today, that they don't really have the fight in them to push back or speak up? We know that there's this fear out there that people have, that their lives and livelihood are going to be destroyed if they dare criticize the regimes in power. Do you think that we've come to a point in our society where people are just too cowardly, or do you think people will start showing courage?
Well, I think there's a significant contingent of the American population, for example, that is very, very recalcitrant and will not be mowed over. They will withstand this, and they will resist it. I believe that's pretty clear. And so we have a contingent that is not going to accept it, and that will fight it and resist it. And that's what we're hoping for. At the very least, we will represent a remnant that will pass the free market and freedom and liberty to the future. We'll keep it alive amongst ourselves and pass it along. And we may need to create parallel economic structures to do so, a parallel social order, if you will, that withstands all of this and that maybe even more or less not politically, but technically secedes from the regime. And that's what we need to do.
And I think you're seeing it starting in the United States. I think we're starting to see it crop up in Europe. And I think we're actually seeing it in the places that have been impacted by ESG, where the people are suffering. They're now standing up and pushing back. Michael, I encourage everyone to get the book, The Great Reset and the Struggle for Liberty. I'm going to have links up at the P.A.S. Report website. Michael, thank you for joining me.
Oh, thanks for having me, Nick. Great to be here.
I want to thank Michael for joining me, and be sure to check out his book, The Great Reset and the Struggle for Liberty. I have the link up at the PAS Report website, pasreport.com, so check it out. For Wednesday, I have a great episode I'm working on. I'm going to explain how DEI is systematically destroying academia, the idea of academic excellence, the whole merit thing that's going on in Virginia, where they hid merit awards from students and parents. They delayed giving them, all in the name of equity. It shows how destructive DEI is, but it's only going to get worse. And I am going to explain how destructive and empty DEI is, but how it's expanding and how they are trying to create an army of activists going forward. So make sure that you tune in. As always, share this episode with family and friends and on social media. If you find the podcast informative, please take 30 seconds to write a review on any podcast platform that allows it. I want to thank you for joining me, and I'll be back on Wednesday with another great episode of the PAS Report.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast.
Have a good one. Bye.
Be sure to rate, share, and subscribe to the podcast so you'll never miss an episode. Also, visit PASreport.com and follow us on Twitter at PAS Report.